All right, welcome back to the next section, where we will now take your CSS skills to the next level. So, up until this point, we have used CSS to add visual styles and spacing to elements. However, CSS can be used for much more than just that. And in fact, one of the main applications of CSS is to build layouts. And so that's what we're going to do next. So in this section, you will learn how to build layouts using floats and also using two really modern technologies, which are called Flexbox and CSS Grid. And in fact, this is going to be one of the most important sections of this course. And so really make sure to take all the time that you need to understand it. That's really important. But anyway, let's get back to work right away. This entire section is all about building layouts. And so before we actually start doing that, let's talk about what layout actually means and also the three major ways in which we can build layouts in CSS right now. So in web design and web development, when we say layout, what we mean is basically the way that text, images, and all the other content is placed and arranged on the web page. So here on the right side, I have an example of a very simple website, and there are a couple of pieces of content, and clearly they are arranged in a certain way, right? And so again, the way in which they are arranged and placed here on this website is the layout of the design, essentially. So the layout gives this page what we call a visual structure, and then into that structure we can place the content. Now, one of the main jobs as front-end developers, so as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript developers, is to build layouts, which is the reason why we have an entire section on building layouts alone. So according to this definition of layout, building a layout means to arrange page elements into some kind of visual structure instead of simply having all of our elements, so all of our content, basically placed one after another. Just imagine that in this example website, all these 7 pieces of content would simply be laid out one after the other. That wouldn't look very interesting visually, right? And it also wouldn't make a lot harder to actually understand the content that is being transmitted here. So layout exists for a reason, because it makes our sites easier to understand and also makes it visually more pleasing. Now, there are basically 2 types of layouts, which are page layout and component layout. So page layout is basically what I've been talking about up until this point, which is laying out the elements, so the big pieces of content inside of a web page or a website. Now, on the other hand, these bigger page layouts are themselves made of components like this one. And these components themselves need to have some kind of layout, because these components themselves are made out of smaller pieces of content which also need to be arranged in some kind of way. And so we can say that components themselves also have a layout. So once again, we wouldn't want to have these 12 pieces of content simply laid out one after another, right? That wouldn't make a lot of sense. And so therefore, we also need to give these smaller components some kind of layout. Okay, so now that we know what layouts are and what type of layouts we can build, now let's see how we can actually build them with CSS. And the first technique of building layouts in CSS is using float layouts, which is basically the old way of building layouts using the float CSS property. Now, these types of layouts are quickly getting replaced by newer technologies such as Flexbox and CSS Grid, but in some cases they are still being used, and especially on older websites. So we will still learn how to build float layouts, just so you know how they work in case you ever see one at some point in your career, for example when you're working on an older website. But for the main part, we will then quickly move on to one of the newer ways of building layouts, which is using Flexbox. So Flexbox is one of the modern ways of laying out elements, and in the case of Flexbox, it is perfect for building one-dimensional layouts. So basically a layout which is just a row, and all without using floats. So Flexbox might be perfect for simpler component layouts, just like we saw in the last slide. Then the other modern way of laying out elements is CSS Grid. So with CSS Grid, we can actually build complete two-dimensional layouts, which is perfect for big page layouts and also more complex components like the one that we saw in the last slide. So Flexbox and CSS Grid have completely revolutionized the way in which we build layouts in CSS right now. And so we will spend most of the course learning them and using them in our big website project later. But for now, let's actually start quickly learning float layouts in the next lecture. Now, before we can actually build a float layout, first we need to understand how the float property actually works. So that is going to be the goal of this lecture. So in this section, we will keep working on our blog post page from the Code magazine. And we will use each of the three methods of building layouts to create a layout like this. So at this point, you see that the header here, which has the heading and the navigation, now occupies basically the entire page from left to right. We have the heading and navigation side by side. And then here below, we actually have now these related posts as a sidebar. So we have this content here on the left side and the sidebar on the right side, both below this complete header. And then down here in the end, we have this footer, which again goes from left to right. Now here it has this weird color, but we're going to fix that, of course, later. But what matters is that this is the kind of very simple layout that we will build using float layouts, Flexbox, and CSS Grid. Okay, but for now, in order to get started with this section, I will create new starter files here on my desktop. So since we are building on the previous section, I will simply go ahead and copy this folder and basically duplicate it here. And we'll then rename it to CSS layouts. But once again, just like in the previous section, you actually don't need to do this if you don't want to. So if you want, you can simply keep working in the same files, so in the same project folder that you have been using up until this point. So that's no problem. I'm just doing this so that later in the end, I have it all nicely organized so I can provide you with the final and initial files for each of the sections. Okay, but anyway, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And then here I like to right-click to create a new window, then open folder on the desktop. This is the one that I want. Okay, and in the meantime, actually my VS Code has updated, so it now looks a little bit different, but that is of course not important. So what matters here is that our files are exactly as we left them before. So let's open up the relevant ones, close the sidebar, and then let's go back to our live connection. So I click again on Go Live, and so here is that page back. So again, this is exactly how we left it before, and so this is going to be the starting point for now. Okay, so let's go here to the very bottom of our page. So here we are now starting to learn about floats. So I will create like a small section here in our CSS. And in order to actually start learning about floats, let's look here at this piece of our page. So what if we actually wanted these two elements here to appear side by side? So right now they are not side by side, because remember that this here is a paragraph element, which is by default a block level element. And so therefore it occupies its own line. So it created a line break before and after its element. Now we could fix that by making this paragraph an inline or an inline block element, but let's now actually explore another way, which is using floats. So let's give each of these two here a class name in our HTML so that we can easily select them. So this one actually already has the ID of author. As I mentioned before, I prefer to always use classes. And so I'm also giving it the class of author, and here the class of, let's say, author image. Okay. And let's also add the style or the selector for the author already. Okay, and now let's use the float property. And in this case, we are going to set it to left. But here you can see a couple of different options for float, and mainly we can use left, right, or none. So let's use left. And with this, what is going to happen is that this image is basically going to be taken out of the document's flow, just like an absolutely positioned element. Now the difference here with floats is that then all the other elements will basically float around it. So let's give it a save and see what happens. And so here is the result of creating that flow. So as I said, this element here is now basically flowing around this one. And if I added a lot more text, then that would become even more visible. Let's actually do that. So here, let's add some more text. And there is a nice trick in VS Code, which is if you start typing lorem, so L-O-R-M, then you can hit enter. And this will then basically create a bunch of fake text, which we also call blind text. So let's save that. And so now it becomes even more visible how this text now basically floats around this image here, right? So this was just a test. Let's put it back to what it was. And now let's try to add some space here between these elements. So just so we see a little bit better what float actually does. Because now if we set like a padding left to move it, let's say 10 pixels, then nothing actually happened. So let's inspect this. And so you see here in this overlay, let's make it a bit more obvious. So here we can very clearly see that the element itself actually does not start right here where this text is, but it does in fact start right behind the image. And so that's why adding like these 10 pixels of padding, which is actually marked in green if you look closely there on the left, doesn't change a lot. Well, actually it doesn't change anything. So let's put a bit more here, like 50, and still nothing changed, because the element is still behind the image. So we would have to add a lot more, let's say like 80 pixels. And only now it is finally enough to start moving out behind that image. So here we could again confirm that this image has been taken completely out of the page's flow. It is as if the image isn't even on the page, right? It does not really affect the surrounding elements. Now let's just, before we continue, add some padding on the top here as well. Let's say 10 pixels. All right. And now let me show you how we can actually fix the fact that this p element basically starts right at the beginning of the container. so behind the image. So what we can do is to float this element as well. So let's also float it on the left. And so now let's check that out again. And now the element starts right after the floated image. All right. So this all looks a bit weird, probably, and it sounds a bit weird, but this is just how floats work. Okay. We could also set it to right here, and then it would move all the way to the right side of the container. So just like this. But once again, we now actually have more modern ways of doing all of this, and in particular Flexbox and CSS Grid. But still, I believe that it's important that you get the basic knowledge about how floats work. Okay, so let's put it back to left. And now here, let's take this out. And let's simply add some margin to the left, because now that is going to be possible again. Okay, and so now this looks nicely laid out. So it's as if this was a very, very small component layout right here. Now, in order to create some space here between this image, so basically this part here and the image, how could we do that? Well, let's try to add some margin bottom to this image just to see what happens. So margin bottom of 20 pixels. And so you see that a floated element is still able to create some margins around it. All right. So actually here we should also use margin and not padding, right? Because what we want is basically space outside of the element. Let's just move this here down. And in order to do that, I actually used a nice shortcut. So that is here in selection, which is this one. So move line up or move line down, which in my case is Alt or Option arrow key down. So this is an extremely handy shortcut that I actually use all the time in order to move some code around. So again, I can just hit Option up or Option down to move it up and down like this. All right. So this is the basic functionality of float, which is kind of weird, but let's make it even weirder and now add some floats to our elements here. So to this H1 and to this navigation here. Now we could do that in the elements that we already selected. So H1 here and then here in the nav. But actually let's select them again because later on I will then want to get rid of this new code when we leave floats behind. Okay, and selecting these elements again and again is of course not a problem. So we can just select them multiple times and then all of the properties will simply be applied. So what I want to do here is have this float to the left side and then the nav to the right side. So the goal is basically to have them both on the same line and have each of them float to one side. Because that will then create an interesting phenomena that I want to explain you. So float right. And let's see what happens. Well, this is not what I was expecting because the nav is not all the way to the right. So let's debug this here a little bit. And oh, well, in this case, it's actually very simple. Here it is not H2, of course. So I was distracted. It is instead nav. Okay. And now it's more on the right side. And if we open up, well, actually, it doesn't change anything for now. But what matters is that this here is now floated to the right side and this one to the left side. Now, the interesting thing that's happening and that I wanted to show you is if you notice this gray background here, and maybe we can make it a bit more obvious. So this header, let's change this here quickly to red. And so now what we can see here is that this element kind of lost its height. So it looks very weird. In fact, the only reason why it is still visible is because we have some padding here. So if we remove the padding, then this element would disappear completely. So at least the background color behind it. So why is this happening? Well, the reason is that all of its child elements, which are in this case only 2, right? So the header only has 2 child elements, the h1 and the nav, and right now all of them are floated. This means that it's as if these elements would not even be on the page, so as if they had been removed. And so now the element basically has no content anymore. And so that way it makes sense that its height is actually 0. So again, the height is now as if it was 0. The only remaining space that is remaining is because of the padding. And if we come down here to the box model, we can see that. So the width is still 720, but the height is indeed 0. And it's only this padding of 20 pixels on both sides that is still making this element visible. But otherwise, the background color would completely disappear. So exactly what happens if we put this here, the first one to 0, right? So this phenomena is what we call the collapsing element. And when this happens, we say that the element's height has collapsed. And again, this did happen because both of its children are now floated. So it's as if they were not on the page anymore. Now, of course, we do not want that, right? So we still want this element here to have the height that it had before. And we can actually fix that, which is exactly what we will do in the next lecture. But for now, just to finish, let's quickly review how floats work and compare them to absolute positioning. Now, floats are actually not a positioning scheme like absolute positioning, but they are still another way in which elements can be out of flow. And so it actually makes sense to compare it with absolute positioning. So we can achieve a floating element by using float left or float right, just as we learned before. And as I was just saying, when an element is floated, it is removed out of the normal flow. And so in this regard, it is exactly the same as with absolute positioning. Now, what's different about floats is that floated elements do still have an impact on surrounding elements. So text and inline elements will actually wrap around the floated element. And so again, in this regard, floated elements are completely different from absolutely positioned elements, which have no impact and are also not impacted by any of the surrounding elements. Finally, one important characteristic of floats is that the container element will simply not adjust its height to the floated element. And so this is exactly the reason why in the last example that we just saw, we saw that that container element collapsed its height. All right, so I hope this quick overview and comparison will make it easier for you to understand floats. And so in the next lecture, as I was saying, we will now fix that problem of collapsing heights. So see you there soon. So in this lecture, we will quickly learn how to clear floats. So in the last lecture, we created the problem that this red main header element here collapsed its height, which remember was because all of its child elements are right now floated. Okay, and so in order to fix that, we need to now clear those floats. And the easiest way of doing that, which is not the best way, but it is the easiest one, is to simply add another element here to the header and then clear the floats from there. So let's add a div here with the class of clear, and the name here doesn't really matter. Okay, and this element, let's keep it empty because we do not want any content in here, right? So if we give it a save, then nothing changed for now, which again is because now these two elements are floated and this one here is empty. And so it also doesn't have any effect. If we added some content here, then you see that it improved the situation a little bit. But of course, this is not what we want. So to visualize this, let's actually permanently give the main header some other color. And the way I do that is by simply declaring another one here afterwards. So the original one was this one, and then I can just write another one later, and so this one will overwrite the first one. So this way, later I can simply delete this entire line. Okay, but anyway, what I want to do now is to, of course, select that element that we just created here. So this one with the clear class. So select it like this, and then here we can use the clear property. And so on clear, we can use also left, right, and both. Now, if we only wanted to clear left floats, then here we can say clear left, and the same with right. But in this case, we have a left float and a right float, and so we want to clear both of them, and so we use both. And if we now save this, then our problem is indeed fixed. Great. Now, back in the day, we used to build all our layouts using float properties like this. So imagine now that we had a row, and in there we had 4 columns. So we needed one element for each of these columns, and we had them floated all side by side. Then in that situation, the height of the row, so of the parent element of the 4 columns, would collapse. And so then we would have to go in and create an empty div element like that in each of those situations. So that could happen like 10 or 20 times on a page, and so that would not be useful at all, right? And also, we didn't want to clutter up our HTML with all these empty divs. So that's just a bad practice. So let's actually remove this here and take a look at another technique that we can use. Now, before I'm doing that, just keep again in mind that building float layouts is kind of outdated. And so you do not need to understand 100% how all of this works, especially with the clear. But again, I find it important that you have at least some idea of how this works, and especially of this trick that I'm going to show you now, which is called the clear fix hack. So the clear fix hack is something that has been widely used for many, many years in the CSS community. And the reason for that is exactly to avoid having these kind of empty divs, just like I explained here before. So that's not good, and therefore someone came up with the clear fix hack. So the way that it works is that on the element that has the collapsed height, so in this case here on this header, we add a class which was usually called clearFix. So just like this. Okay, so we added the clearFix class there, and then here in the CSS, we selected that, and then we used a pseudo element, and in particular, the after pseudo element. And remember that what this one does is to basically create a new element which will be the last child element of the container. And so in a way, doing this is exactly the same as adding this empty div here manually, right? Because again, what this after pseudo element will do is to insert a brand new element at the very end of the container, which in this case is this header element. So this one here, because now we added the clearFix class to that element as well. And so now we can clear the floats on this one. So clear both. But now remember 2 particularities about the after pseudo element. So first of all, it only appears if we define something for the content property. Remember that? So in content, there needs to be something, even if it's just like empty text. And so this is enough. And then also by default, pseudo elements like after and before are inline elements. However, clearing floats like this only really works on a block level element. And so we set the display property on this element to block. And so with this, the problem should now be fixed as well. And indeed, there you go. So let's check that out quickly. And so here is that pseudo element that we just created. And so now the floats are being cleared here. So if we were to take this off, then you see that the heights are back to being collapsed. Okay, and that's it. So this is how we would clear floats in float layouts. So again, by using this clearFix class, which back in the day was being used all the time, and we called this the clearFix hack. All right, and so now next up, let's use this knowledge to build a very simple float layout in order to make our page look like this. So like the final demo that I have right here. Okay, so we can easily do that with floats. And so let's check it out now. Now that we have a basic knowledge of how floats and clearing floats works, let's build a simple layout for our page. And so what we're looking for is this. So again, here we have our a site finally as a sidebar here on the right side and our main content on the left side. Then we still have the header on the top spanning from one side to the other, and the same down here for the footer. All right, and you also notice that the container is now a lot larger. So we will do all of that, but let's identify the main parts of our layout. So that's the header here, which we already have nicely in place here. Then it is this article, this aside, and the footer down here, right? So let's start by selecting those elements here in our code again. And so I will select them here again for the same reasons as I explained before, which is because later on I will want to delete this code or to deactivate it, and then it wouldn't be good to have these properties in the selectors that we already have up there. So selecting the article, the aside, and the footer. And the header is not really necessary because we already have a lot of work done on it. Okay. Now here, let's quickly get rid of this comment. And now the first thing I'm actually going to do is to work on the container. And in particular, to make it 1200 pixels wide. And this will be the same for all the layouts. So no matter if building it with Float, Flexbox, or CSS Grid. And so I'm doing that up here. All right. And we can also remove this color here again. And so that's a lot better. And so now let's get to work and basically putting this article here on the left side and the aside on the right side. And to visualize this a little bit better, whenever I do something like this, I always give these elements some background color to make it easier to see the boxes on our page. So background color like this. And you see I'm starting more and more to use the VS Code autocomplete function because at some point we know these properties by heart, and then there's not really a need to keep writing them by hand. So the colors here don't really matter, just so we can actually see what is happening. And so now let's get to work. So we already know how Float works, so this shouldn't be too hard. However, before using floats, we actually need to change the width of these two elements that we want to be side by side. So article and aside. So right now, each of them, since they are block elements, occupy 100% of the available width of the container, right? And so again, if we want them to be side by side, each of them needs to have a certain width. So our container is 1200 pixels wide. And so let's divide that up for the article and the aside. So I'm going to give the article a width of 900 of those pixels, and the remaining 300 go to the sidebar. So to this aside. And so 900 plus 300 are exactly the 1200 of the container, right? So that looks like this. And now all there's left to do is to put them side by side. So float left, and then here float right. And actually here we could use both. Okay, and here you go. Now they are nicely side by side. But now notice what happened here with the footer. So the footer is now floating around these two elements as well, because, well, that is exactly what the float property does. It makes it so that the elements that come after it will float around that first element. So here we have first this article, then the aside, and afterwards comes the footer. And so if we set the aside to float, then the element that comes after it will float around it. Okay, so that's just how floats work, which are, again, quite confusing. And that is exactly the reason why later on we will replace floats with CSS Grid and Flexbox. But anyway, if we want this footer here to be back down where we want it to be down here, then we need to clear the float. Okay? However, in this situation, actually we don't need to create any new empty div, or we don't need to use the clearFix class, because we already have that element on which we want to clear the float, right? Which is exactly the footer. Okay? So again, we needed to create an empty div before, or to use the clearFix class, because there was simply no other element on which we could clear the floats. But now there is. So it is this next element which we do not want to float around the other ones. Okay, so let's simply say clear both. So usually don't bother with clear left or right. If you say both, then it's just going to work no matter what. And so now you see it's gone, and it is back down here where it actually belongs. Okay. Now, just quickly about what I said, that in this situation, it doesn't really matter if we used float right or left on the aside. And the reason for that is that there is no empty space between them anyway. So in this case, it doesn't matter. But actually, let's create some space between them. And in this case, using margin or padding is probably not the best approach. So instead, what I will do is to simply decrease the size of this article element here. And so that will then essentially create a gap between the both of these elements. So let's decrease this by 75 pixels. So it will then end up with just 825. And so now there appears this gap, because this element is floated to the left and this to the right. And so then, of course, if we have some remaining space, it will simply stay here in the middle of the two. Now, if we set this one to left, now in this situation, that would not be ideal, because now the empty space would then be here on the right side. So let's put it back, and we can also get rid of the background colors. And with that, we actually finished the layout already. So this is already exactly what it looks like in the demo version, right? Great. So this is how we built a very simple float layout using floats, as I was just saying. Now, again, these are a bit hard to understand and to work with, and that's why the people who work on CSS came up with these modern solutions such as Flexbox and CSS Grid. And we will talk about them very soon, but for now we need to quickly learn about something else, which is to finally change the box model from the default behavior to something that makes more sense. So let's do that in the next video. Let's now see how we can run into problems with the default box model and also how we can fix it. So what we're going to do now is to finally fix the spacing of this sidebar here a little bit. So currently there are no paddings, as you can see here, and this is just a margin, but not a padding. So that's not really right. So let's fix it, and then we will run into a problem, and then we will solve it. All right, so we are actually done here with the code of the layout. So let's go to the aside that we have at the top, because this code we will write now should actually apply to all the layout methods. So let's get rid of these comments here and also of this width, because we already have it defined by the end of the file. So let's give it a save. And now actually the reason why there is some space here is because right at the very beginning, we added some margin here to the UL, so to this unordered list, because otherwise the bullet points disappeared. Remember that? But now we actually don't want that here. So there should be no margin, because that just doesn't make no sense in that case. So here we have that UL and that OL. And so here's the margin left of 50 that I just mentioned. So let's see in our HTML if this list here has some class. Yeah, it does. So it's the related class. So let's copy that. And maybe it's already somewhere. Yeah, here. So related has a list style of none. And let's say that it should have no margin. Okay. So in the UL selector, we have margin left set to something, but we can override all the margins at the same time, left, and set it to 0. Okay, so that's better for now. And so let's now go back and add some padding, right? So when we want space inside of an element, we should not use margin, and so that's why we just remove it. But we still, of course, want some space inside of this aside. And so therefore, we will want to add some padding. So let's say 40 pixels. And now as I save this, watch what happens. So I'm saving it now. And now it suddenly disappeared. So the whole aside is gone. So let's see what happened. And the reason for that is that now the element became too big. So let's inspect that. And so checking the aside. So we defined it at 300 pixels of width, right? But then the padding of 40 pixels that we just added gets added to the total width, simply because that is the default behavior of the box model. And so now the total width of this element is 380, which does no longer fit between the width of this article. So the article is 825 pixels wide. And if you watch closely up here in this corner, as I now hover it, you see that it is a bit wider than there would have been space to fix the aside, right? So how do we fix this problem? Should we now manually change the size of this aside here in order to account for the padding, or is there maybe another way? Well, indeed, there is a better way, and so now it's time to leave behind the default behavior of the box model. And so let's now quickly take a look of how the other version of the box model works and what it looks like. And just to remember, this is the default way of the box model calculating the element's width and the heights. So as we've seen in practice many times, whenever we specify a height or a width, then the box model will add the border and the padding on top of that. And so that's exactly what created the situation that we found ourselves in now on our page, so in our layout, right? So the sidebar grew too big because of the padding, and so it no longer fit close to the article. So wouldn't it be nice if we simply defined a certain height or a certain width, and then the element would simply be exactly that size, no matter what border or padding? Well, actually, of course, we can do that, simply by adding a little property to the element, which is called box sizing, and we set the value of that property to border box. So that's a nice and simple trick that actually every single CSS developer uses. So it would be completely impossible to build large layouts without using box sizing border box. So again, the default way of the box model actually doesn't make any sense at all. So instead, everyone simply adds box sizing border box to all elements, which will then forever fix the kind of problems that we just experienced. So as we can see in this new diagram where box sizing has been set to border box, now the specified width and height goes all the way from one side of the border to the opposite side of the border, including of course the content area and the padding. And so now the final width and height calculations are very simple. There's actually nothing left to calculate. So the final width of any element will simply be exactly the width that we define in our code, no matter the padding and borders. And the same, of course, goes for the height. So if we now define some paddings or borders, they will not get added to the dimensions of the box, which really makes our lives so much easier. Now, what this also means at the same time is that padding and borders that we do specify will now reduce the inner width of the content area. But that's usually not a problem. Okay, and so now let's go back to our code and actually apply this property. Okay, and so let's now do exactly what I showed you in the slide and set box sizing to border box. And by the way, the default behavior is actually called content box. Okay, but of course what we want is border box. And so if we save this now again, we should see that problem fixed. And indeed, now it works. So if we check out our box model now, of course the entire site, then you see that the width of the content area is no longer the 300 that we defined, but instead the entire width of the element is this 220 plus 40 plus this 40, which if we add it all together, that makes exactly 300 pixels, which is the width that we defined for this element right here. Okay, so that's exactly what I was saying by the end of the slide I just showed you. So that when we add some padding to an element, then that will subtract from the content area, right? And so again, the width of the content area is now only 220, but that's not a problem at all, because what we're really interested in is the width of the entire element itself. And so that is now exactly the 300 that we specified. Because otherwise, let's just toggle it off one more time. Then you see down here that we are back to having the 300 applied to the content area and then 40 on each side on top of that. So that's not what we want. And so here we fix that. Nice. Now, we always want the box model to work like this by default on every single element from here on. And so basically what we want is for this property here to be applied to every single element on the page. So how can we do that? Well, I will cut it from here, and then I will put it here in the universal selector. Okay, and I'm not putting it here in the body because box sizing is not one of these properties that gets inherited. So we can't put it on the body selector, but instead on the universal selector. And so now, along with margin and padding, this box sizing border box gets applied to every single element. So give it a save and it still works. So something like this here is what most developers actually add to their CSS. So a simple global reset like this, and then basically enabling this better behavior of the box model on every single element. Okay, with that, we're actually done. I'm just quickly going to add some margin here to the bottom of this H4, since we are talking about fixing spacing. Margin bottom, let's say 20 pixels. Or let's make it a bit more and say 30 pixels. Great. So you just learned one more very important thing on your journey of becoming a CSS developer. So what I just showed you, again, is something that every single CSS developer does and uses. And so it was really important that you learned about this important trick. And it's also important that you really understand how it works. So make sure that you maybe review that slide that I showed you and review the code that we wrote here. And then you are ready for yet another coding challenge. So hopefully I see you there very soon. Now it's time for you to build your own float layout in order to practice everything that we have learned in this section so far. And once again, in this section, we will keep working on this shoe example here. And so this is how we left it after the last challenge. And so, as always, please use that as a starting point. And if you don't have the code, then just get it from a link that I will place in this lecture. Okay, but anyway, after building our float layout here, this is what our component is supposed to be looking like. Now, the very first thing that you should probably do is to activate that box sizing trick, so what we learned in the last lecture. And then from there, you can start using floats. For example, in order to place this free shipping label here at the right side, so right beside this price here. Then down here, as for these colors, here we actually don't need to use floats because we already solved this problem before in another challenge. So we used inline blocks to place these colors here all side by side. Remember that? And so there's no need to change that now. And then finally, the biggest part of this challenge is to create this layout where these three parts are side by side. So what I want you to do is to create one container which will contain this image, then which will contain one element which contains all of this, and then one element which contains all of this. So right now I think all of this content here is simply one after another without any separation, so without being in separate boxes, right? Yeah, so that's the case. But right now, what I need you to do is to put these two here in one box and these, so all of these here in another box, so that you can then put them side by side, just like we have it here. All right. So again, all of this here should be in one container element, and then as child elements, there should be this image, then a div, so a box which contains all of this, and then another div which contains these two. Then between these elements here, we have 40 pixels of space, so here and here, and then based on that, you will need to figure out the width of both these elements here. So this one and this one. And if that sounds too hard or too confusing, then don't worry. You can just use a width of 240 pixels, and I will then explain you how I calculated the exact width for each of the boxes. Okay, and I think that's it for the instructions that you need for this challenge. And maybe you can write them down to make it a bit easier for you to follow them. Because actually there's a lot to do here, and so this really is a real challenge for you. So once again, don't worry if you are not able to complete it 100%. All that matters is that you write at least some of the code on your own and that you try it. Okay? So take all the time that you need and then just come back here to the video to see my solution. So, how did you do? Hopefully you did at least part of this challenge, and so let's get started. So as I said, the first thing I'm going to do is to fix the box model by saying box sizing border box, of course. And then let's start by working with these two elements here to put them side by side. So that's the price and the shipping. So that's easy enough. So float left, so not keft, obviously. And then here float right. Okay. So that doesn't look right somehow. And so the reason for that is that now this image is bigger, and so it is floating around it as well. So probably what we should do now already is to put all the content here inside that container that I mentioned. So everything that comes after this image should be in a new div, which I'm calling here the product info. Okay, so we open that here, and then we want everything in there until the end of the colors. So here we close it. And again, unfortunately, CodePen does not automatically do the formatting for us. But let's just leave it like this. We don't need to worry too much about this small example. So anyway, I will now put this other content, so these two here, inside of another div, just as I told you to do in the instructions part. And this one I'm calling the product details. Okay, and then close it right here after this UL and before the button. And so now each of them is in its own box. So we fixed that problem that the image is no longer between these two pieces of content, but we still have a problem, which is that now this paragraph here is floating around, or basically in between now, these two pieces of content, right? And so what we can do is to take a look at this element, so which is this one, the product description, and then clear the float right there. So where is that? Let's see. Well, I think I actually hadn't used this yet. So let's paste it up here. And let's say clear both. And there you go. That fixes that floating problem, right? So whenever you have a problem with floats, with some elements placing itself where you don't want it to be, then you can simply clear the floats like this. Now, another solution would have been to wrap these two elements here inside of another container element, and then we could have added the clearfix class to that container. So that clearfix hack that I showed you a bit earlier, that we will actually also need for something in a second. But anyway, this is now done. And so let's now worry about the overall layout here. So the elements that participate in the layout are, of course, these three boxes. So this image, this box that we just created, and this one. Right? So that's the image, that's the product info. So let's put that here right at the top of the product information. And then also the product details. And so let's put that here close to the details. Okay. And so, as I was saying, the first thing that we need to do is to determine a width for these elements. All right. So let's do that. And I will add a comment here so that I can show you the math that is happening. So the total width of this container is 825, right? And it also has a border of 4 on each side. So the math here is 280 pixels minus 8, which are the two borders on each side. Then minus 250, which is the width of this image. So where is that? Let's see. It doesn't seem to be somewhere here. Yeah, actually we set that height and width right here. So that's why I couldn't see it, but yeah, I knew it was 250. So we need to subtract that as well from the total. So that's not 280, that's 825. So don't know where that came from. And then remember how I said that we want 40 pixels right here and right here. And so that is also space that we cannot use for the columns. So we need to subtract that as well. So minus 80. So basically the result of this calculation here will be the exact amount of space that we have remaining to fill up with the columns. So I will just do the math here using this functionality on the Mac, but you can just do it any other way. So 850 minus 8 minus 250 minus 80. So that is the total width that is available for the two columns, but we have two of them. And so we need to divide all of this by 2. So wrap it in parentheses, divide by 2. And so the result is 243.5 pixels. So let's not use the point, and let's just use 443 pixels. So with 243 pixels. So divided by 2. Then let's put the same on the other column here. So that's this one. Okay, so that worked. And now all we have to do is to float all of these three elements. So first the image, which actually we haven't selected yet. So let's give it a class of product image. And let's put that somewhere here, maybe. Well, actually not. Let's put it actually outside here. So the height and width we don't need to define using CSS because that's already in here. But let us define the float and float it to the left. And now the same with all the other ones. So float to the left and like this. And let's copy this simply for the other one and float left as well. All right, so that looks nice already. Now we just need to add those 40 pixels of spacing that we wanted. So let's use margin for that. So I will just add a margin right on the image and on this element right here. So margin right 40 pixels. And then also on this one. And with that, well, we are looking pretty close already to our final layout, right? Let's just add some like cosmetic details here. So adding some padding here to the top of this one. So padding 40 pixels, let's say. Well, that's a bit too much. Okay. And now I'm noticing that these colors somehow no longer fit down here. So let's see why that might be. Well, maybe we need to decrease the space a little bit between them. Or actually, I did a mistake here. So I added the padding to all the sides and so therefore is now all too small. So I just wanted a padding top of 20 pixels. Yeah, and now that looks a lot better, of course. Now next up, let's add some margin here to this free shipping label. So to kind of manually align it to this value here. So margin top, let's say 8 pixels. And by the way, all of these things, like manually aligning elements like this, will all be a thing of the past once we start using Flexbox. Okay, so Flexbox will be so helpful, it's gonna be incredible. We will not have to do any of these like guessing numbers to align vertically. We also will not have to do manual calculations of width like this. So all of this will be automatically figured out by Flexbox in the future. So that's going to be so helpful, and I can't wait to show it to you actually. Now let's just add some space here to this paragraph. So let's see if I have already selected that. Yeah, here it is. So let's say margin bottom of 10 pixels right there. And then finally, let's fix the spacing here a little bit. So here is a lot more spacing than here. And that's because we still have that margin top on the product details. So let's fix that. So on this product details title. So this is the one I mean. So let's get rid of that. And let's instead add a margin to the top of 20 pixels like we did here in this other one. Actually here I think we used padding, but margin is better of course. So let's go back also to this other box. And yeah, so instead of padding, let's use margin here. And so that looks the same. And with this, we are actually finished. So that looks just like this. And so challenge completed successfully. Now, there are some things that we could have done a bit differently. So for example, I told you that we would need the clearfix class, but actually we ended up not needing it. So what we could have done would have been to wrap these 3 elements here into a container. And actually that's what I told you to do, right? So, well, why not then just do that? So that's not too hard. So let's do that here. A div with the class of container. And then we need to close it right at the very end before this button. All right. So let's select that container here to give it a background color. Okay. And now you see that the color is actually nowhere to be seen. So in order to figure out why that is, let's inspect this. So we have the article, and then in there is the H2, and then there is the container. But now you see that this container has a height of 0. So why do you think that is? Well, once again, it's because of collapsed heights. So this element technically has no height because all of its child elements are floated, right? So the child elements are these 3. So the image, it is the product info and the product details. And so remember how we floated all of these 3 elements. And so that means that the container right now has no element that is not floated. And so therefore its height collapsed. Okay, and if for some reason we really needed to fix that, then we could use a clearfix class for that. So again, this does not need to be called clearfix, but this is just a general name that is used. So content is nothing, display is block, and of course, finally, clear is set to both. And let's wait for it. Of course, we also need to add it here to this element. Clear fix. And yeah, so now that turned red, which means that the container is back to having a height. Okay, and let's comment that out here. And so, yeah, now that's really it. But again, it actually also worked without this container element because we had all of the space here nicely divided up. So we said exactly how wide each of these elements here should be. And so therefore, there was no space for any of the next elements, in this case, the button, to float around them. Okay. But again, I'm sure that sounds a bit confusing. And the reason for that is that I'm not going super deep into how floats and clears actually work, because for the rest of the course, we will now replace them with Flexbox and CSS Grid, which make all of this a lot easier, trust me. So if you're excited about that, then don't wait and let's move right to our next lecture here. Welcome back. So I've been mentioning Flexbox many times now, but now it's finally time to start using it for the very first time. Now, before I actually explain you what Flexbox actually is and how exactly it works, I want to start by actually using it a little bit in practice. And to learn the very basics of Flexbox, actually the context of a project like this is not ideal. And so we will learn it a little bit in isolation. So actually you need some files now from the starter files of this section. So let's come here, which remember is this folder that I downloaded from GitHub. And then here in the starter files for this section, so CSS layouts, grab this flexbox.html and the CSS grid.html, and then copy them into the folder that you are currently working in. And so in my case, that is here on the desktop, this one. So let's paste them there and make sure that it really is inside of the folder that you're currently working in VS Code. So otherwise, everything else I show you will not work. And now if we go here to our sidebar, then indeed, here we now have flexbox.html. And so this is kind of a starter file, so we can quickly learn just the very basics of Flexbox in isolation. Okay, so now in order to access them here in our browser, let's actually go back to index.html, which is this page here, right? And then up here in our navigation, maybe you remember that we actually set some links there. So this one that says Flexbox and CSS Grid. And so here I will now actually connect these HTML files. So right now this link points to nowhere, but now I actually want it to go to flexbox.html. And then the same thing here for CSS Grid. All right. And so now if we come here to our page and click on Flexbox, it will go to that flexbox.html file that we specified. So it is still at this URL here, and then /flexbox.html. All right. And so that is, again, this file right here. So here I have some starter code. So basically this container element, which contains these 8 elements in there. And so all of them have a different background color as I defined up here. All right. And so now let's come here to this element called container and let's start using Flexbox. And it's actually very simple. So all we have to do in order to get started with Flexbox is to use the display property and set it to flex on some container element. And with container element, I simply mean any element that has a couple of child elements. So just like this one. But of course, it could have any other class name here. So we already knew the display property, but now we get a new value. And so again, the one that we want is to set it to flex. So give it a save and let's see what happens. And immediately it looks different, right? So all these elements are now immediately side by side without having to use any floats or anything like that. And these elements here, we call them the flex items because they are the child element of the flex container. So again, this element here is the flex container, and these 8 child elements are the flex items. All right. Now here, each of these elements occupies exactly the space that it needs for its content. And so you see that actually we don't have enough space here. So let's give us actually some more space. So something like this. Or maybe to make it easier, we could just make the text a little bit smaller. And so now you can see that each of the flex items needs a lot less space. And by the way, this gray space that you see here after the last flex item is simply the background color of the rest of the empty container. So that's this color here. All right. So let's see if we now have enough space. And yeah, that looks nice. Can increase that a little bit more again, even 34. And yeah, so now we're good to go. Now, again, horizontally, each of these elements takes up exactly the space that is necessary for its text content. However, vertically, things are a bit different. So vertically, by default, all the flex items are as tall as the tallest element, which in this case has 150 pixels because we set this third one, so the green element, with a height of 150 pixel. And if we change this like to 250, then you would see that all of them grow taller. And if this wasn't present here at all, then in the end, all of them would simply also have the height to occupy only the space that's necessary for the content. But let's actually put this back because this can be helpful to demonstrate a couple of different things. So in order to demonstrate just how powerful Flexbox can be, let me show you one of its most useful applications, which is vertical centering. So to basically center all these items vertically, all we have to do is to say align items and then simply center. And let's see what happens. And indeed, they are now vertically aligned, just as expected. So the flex container still takes the height of the highest element, which is still this one of 150 pixels, but now all the other ones simply take the space that they need for the text, or in general for the content, and then they get vertically aligned in the center. Let's try another one here. So to put them at the very start, we use flex start like this. And to put them at the bottom, we use flex end. All right. And by default, the value of align items is stretch. And so now we will see exactly the result that we had at the beginning. So stretch essentially means that all the elements will automatically stretch as tall as the tallest element. All right, but let's actually put it back to center because this is one of the most important applications of Flexbox. Just imagine how hard it would be to do this without Flexbox. So we would have to manually select all of these elements except for the green one and then kind of try to guess some margin at the top so that they then looked aligned in the center. But here it all happens automatically. And of course, we can also center them horizontally. So basically center all of these items inside of the flex container. So we do that with justify content. and set it to center. And you see that now the space here is the same on this side and on this side. And so that means that they are now centered inside of the container. But actually, this property here, so justify content, that is part of the Flexbox specification, gives us a couple of other really helpful and nice options here. So for example, we can also say space between and watch what happens then. So you see that basically the remaining space is now distributed evenly between all of these elements. So basically they have now this space which is the same between all of them. So you see here and here and here, and it's really all the same in all the places. All right. And we will actually go a lot deeper into all of these properties, and there are of course a lot more, but for now I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of how we can get started using Flexbox. So maybe and hopefully you start seeing how powerful this is. And so now that we know the basics, let's get a high-level overview of all the properties that are part of the Flexbox specification in the next lecture. Let's now define what exactly Flexbox is and when and why we need it, and also talk about some important terminology around Flexbox, and finally also get an overview of all the properties that are part of the Flexbox specification. So a one-line definition of Flexbox is that it is a set of related CSS properties that we can use to build one-dimensional layouts. Now, when Flexbox was developed a couple of years ago, the main idea behind it was to basically allow browsers to automatically divide empty space inside some container element by its child elements. And by doing that, the browser takes away a lot of work that previously the web developers had to do. So by defining manually width and stuff like that, so a bit like we did in our last coding challenge. So with Flexbox, all of that would happen automatically. Now Flexbox also makes it extremely easy to automatically align items to one another inside a certain parent container. And that is true both horizontally and vertically. And in fact, we already saw that working a little bit in the previous lecture, right? And so with this, Flexbox solves a couple of very common problems in CSS development, such as vertical centering and also creating equal height columns. So these used to be hard problems before Flexbox came along, but now with modern CSS, these are very, very simple to solve. And so since you are learning CSS only now with these modern technologies already in place, you will never know how difficult this used to be. So consider yourself very lucky by that. So basically what I just said is that Flexbox is perfect for replacing the old school floats. And by that, it allows us to write fewer and also cleaner HTML and CSS code, which of course is very easy to maintain websites over the long run and to write less bugs. Okay, so now that we know what Flexbox is exactly and what problems it helps us solve, let's talk a little bit about some important terminology. And actually, there are not many concepts behind Flexbox that you need to understand in order to start using it. But here is what you do need to know. So first of all, the element on which we want to use Flexbox is called the Flex container. So just as I mentioned in the last lecture as well. And all we have to do in order to create a Flex container is to set its display property to Flex, and that's it. That's how we get started with Flexbox. So if we do this, then all the direct children of that Flex container will become the so-called Flex items. And this is actually important to know and to keep in mind, because we will use different properties on the Flex container and on the Flex items. Now, the direction in which these Flex items are laid out is called the main axis, which is represented with this arrow here. Then the other perpendicular axis is simply called the cross axis. And it's important to know about these names because we can actually change the direction of the main axis and so therefore also of the cross axis. Plus, we can align elements along the main axis and along the cross axis in different ways, and therefore we always need to know which axis we are dealing with. So try to keep these concepts in mind so that you can fully understand how the different Flexbox related properties work. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about next. So in this slide, before we actually move to the practice part, I want to show you an overview of all the CSS properties that are part of the Flexbox specification, both for the Flex container and for the Flex items. So for the Flex container, the most important ones are the gap, the justify content, and the align items properties. And in fact, we already talked about two of them in the last lecture, right? Now, I'm not going to go over all the details here. Just know that the first value that is in bold is the default value, and then the other ones are the possible options that we can specify. And then also you have a very short description of each of the properties. And so my hope is that you can use this slide kind of as a cheat sheet to print out or to create a print screen image that you can always have handy when you are working with Flexbox. I actually did this in the very beginning when I started learning Flexbox, and it was really, really helpful because it is in fact impossible to know all of these properties by heart at all times and also know exactly what they do. So again, I think it would be a great idea to print out this slide and keep it as a cheat sheet close to your keyboard or whatever you use on your working space. But anyway, there are three other properties that we can apply on the Flex container element, which are Flex direction, Flex wrap, and align content. And actually, some of these, especially number 5 and 6, are used for pretty advanced Flexbox techniques that we will not study in this course because I think they are a bit too confusing for beginners. So in this course, which is more of a beginner CSS course, my goal is just that you really understand the fundamentals of Flexbox and are able to use them on your own. And with these fundamentals, trust me, you can solve 99% of all the most common scenarios. But now moving on a bit to properties that we can apply on the Flex items themselves. One of them is align auto, which is pretty important because this can basically override the align items property. Then we have these other ones, which are flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis, and these three together, so 2, 3, and 4, form the flex property. So as you can see below number 5 there, flex is the recommended shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Okay, and again, we will go over them a little bit later in this section once we actually can start using them in practice. Finally, there is also the order property, which we can use to basically change the order of the Flex items visually on the page without changing their order in the source code. Okay, but enough talking now. Let's now move back to code and start learning many of these properties one by one. So now that we know a little bit more about Flexbox, let's now keep using it in practice. And in this lecture, we will learn a little bit more about aligning Flex items and also how to create space between them. And hopefully you printed out that cheat sheet from the last lecture, but in any way, let's now get started. So, in our very first lecture about Flexbox, we already talked about these two properties here, so align items and justify content, which are both properties that apply to the Flex container. And now, after the last lecture, we also know that justify content is basically to align items along the main axis. And so that's this one here, right? And so by default, that is horizontally. All right, so if we set this to center, for example, then you see that our items are being horizontally centered, right? And so again, by default, that is the main axis. So along this way where I'm moving my mouse right now. Then we have align items, which aligns items along the cross axis, which by default is vertically. And that's why if we set center, then these elements here are vertically centered. And for example, if we set it to flex start, then they all move to the top. And so again, it's all about vertical alignment by default. Now I mentioned that we could switch the direction of these axes, but for now, let's not get even more confused. So let's set it here to center, and here let's actually set it to the default, which is flex start. So just like this. All right. So these are two of the most important properties that apply to the flex container, and another one is gap. But let's leave that for the end of this lecture. And now let's keep talking about aligning items, but now using the align self property, which applies to flex items. So basically, using align items on the flex container will make it so that all the flex items will have the same alignment. So in this case, all aligned to the center. However, in many situations, we want to override that for one single element. And so for that, we use the align self property. So let's, for example, select our very first element here. So that's EL-1. And so here, let's say that we want this one aligned to the top. And so we can say align self. And then here the values are the same. So flex start. And with that, the element and only this one moved to the very top. Let's try another one. For example, element 4, for example. And let's say align self. And this one, let's say we want to stretch it. So stretch would be the default if we didn't set it, let's say globally here on the flex container, right? And so now this one is also stretched just like the CSS here. Well, let's put it on the 5 just to add some space between them. So now it is this one that goes all the way from top to bottom. And once again, if we change the height of this one, then of course the height of here the pink one would be stretched as well to the maximum possible. But let's put that back. And yeah, so this is one of the most important properties that we can use on the flex items. Let's now just very quickly also talk about the order property, since we're already here anyway. So changing the order in which flex items are displayed on the page can be very helpful when we are adapting a bigger layout to a small layout for mobile screens. Now, the default value for all elements is always 0. And so if we want to move an element to the very first position, all we need is to specify a number that is lower than that. So let's try element number 6 here, for example. So missing the 6 here. And again, by default, the order is 0 for all of them. So you might think that the order is like 1 in the first one, then second, number 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But that's not the case. By default, they're all 0. And so if we want to move one of them to the first position, we simply need to give them a number that's lower than that, such as -1. And so now the languages, which is number 6, as we can see here, now moved to the very front here of the row. So now it became the very first element. And the same is true, of course, if we want to move an element to the back. So let's try this one. And so if we specify a value that is larger than 0, so larger than all the other ones, then it will simply move to the back. So it will become the last one. And so this pink one now should become the last. And indeed, it is. And if we then want to make another one the last, let's say this one, then we simply need yet another number that is even larger. So let's say 2. So that is this one. And so now that one is the last. Okay, but let's turn that off. And yeah, the other ones, we can actually leave them on just for the fun of it. All right. So that's the fundamentals of aligning. So here on justify content, there are some more values that you can experiment with. And again, all of them are on that cheat sheet that I showed you by the end of the last lecture. But the most prominent one are center and I would say space between or space around, as I showed you in the first Flexbox lecture of all. Great. So we know the fundamentals of aligning elements now, both vertically and horizontally. And now let's talk a little bit about adding space between them. So adding space manually, because we saw already how we can use Flexbox to automatically create space between flex items using justify content, right? But now I'm talking about manually creating space, which is most of the time even more important actually. So in practice, many times we are in fact interested in manually defining space between our flex elements. And so there are 2 ways currently of doing that. So the original one was to simply add margins to the flex items like this. So selecting basically all the elements like this. So that will select all 8 of them. And then let's say we can just add a margin to the right side of like 40 pixels. So give it a space, maybe a little less than that. Okay. And well, we are still overflowing the container. So actually, let's get rid of these last 2 here. That should help a little bit. And yeah, that does look a bit better. Can also make maybe the font size here back to being a bit smaller, or 32. And yeah. So with this, we basically created 30 pixels of space between all of these elements, right? However, now in order to really get this right, we would then have to go in and remove the margin right from the very last element, which can be a bit of a pain. So it's an extra step. And also it's way nicer to have the definition of a gap between these elements right here in the container. So then we have basically all the definitions of how the flex items look like right there in the container element. And again, that is actually a lot nicer. So maybe that doesn't make sense at this point, but you will see with practice that it is actually a good practice, or it's actually helpful to have all of this in the flex container. And so therefore, a new property was added to Flexbox, which is called gap. So we can remove this here. Then we are back to the beginning. And then we can very simply add the gap property and set it to 30 pixels as well. And there we go. So we are back to having the same gap basically, but now it is nicely in the flex container. And also if we inspect this, we see that none of them has any margins. And so there's no need to then remove the margin from the last element there. All right. And I think that's actually it for the fundamentals of aligning and creating space between elements. And all of this will make more sense, of course, once we move from these like abstract boxes here to some real world example, for example, or project, right? But for now, we will keep working on this small demo here. And in the next lecture, we will talk about one of the most important properties, which is the flex property. So stay tuned for that. And then after that, we will finally return to our project. Let's now learn the basics of the flex property, which is the property that we use in order to actually size flex items. And remember how I showed you in the flexbox property overview how the flex property is actually a shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex spaces. And so let's now talk about each one of these three one by one. And to start, actually let me write that down here because this is really important to keep in mind. So removing this, let me just write that here, and also the default value. So the default for flex grow is 0. For flex shrink, it is 1. And for flex spaces, it's auto. So let's create a comment here, comment all of this out. Then here I will write defaults. And so like this, you can keep this here handy to check out this information in case we need it. And let's actually now start with flex spaces. So when we want to size flex items, and in particular with a width, then we usually do not use the width property, but instead we use flex bases. So let's say we want these elements to have a width of 100 pixels. Then, as I said, we use flex bases and set that to our width. So let's see. And what happened here is that now some of these elements do actually have a width of 100 pixels, but when the content is larger than 100 pixels, then the element actually extends to fit that content. So let's inspect that here. Here with the box model. And actually, even this element is not 100 pixels wide. So let's remove the gap that we have here to give ourselves some more space. Okay, and so that looks a lot better. So this one is now 100 pixels. This one is 2, and so is this and this. But then amazing is 120 pixels, and languages is even bigger at almost 150 pixels. So what this means is that flex spaces is not really rigid. So it's more like a recommendation that we make to the browser, but the browser will then, based on the content, figure out the optimal length. All right. And let's see what happens if we actually make this like really big, like let's say 200 pixels. Give it a save. And to see this effect a bit better, let's actually turn off this last element here. All right. And so you see that these three elements are the same size, I think. So HTML is 140, 140, 140, and in fact, all of them are 140 big. And so that's nowhere near 200 pixels, right? And the reason for that is that by default, Flexbox is allowed to shrink elements so that they fit the container. And so that's what the flex shrink here set to 1 actually means. So again, if there's not enough space in a container to fit the items with the size that we describe here using flex spaces, then Flexbox is allowed to shrink these items by default because flex shrink is set to 1. However, if we want to change that, which sometimes we might want, then we can simply set this to 0. And so now you see that they are indeed 200 pixels wide. But then, of course, the content no longer fits the container. All right. So setting flex shrink to 0 is not always advisable, but in some situations it's necessary. And we will actually come across one of those in our big 𝗦𝗣𝗜𝗖𝗎 project later in the course. Okay. So essentially what flex shrink does is to determine whether Flexbox is allowed to shrink element if necessary or not. All right. And finally, there's also basically the opposite of that, which is flex grow, and which determines whether elements are allowed to grow as large as they can or not. So let's try that. So let's say flex grow set to 1. And in this case, it actually doesn't make much sense to have the flex spaces. But let's just see what happens in this situation. Well, now nothing changed. So let's actually turn this one here off. All right. And now you see that all of them have exactly the same size. And in total, they filled up the entire flex container. And so that's exactly what flex grow set to 1 is doing. Okay. So if we turn that off right here, then each of the elements would simply be back to occupying the width that they need to fit the content. But again, if we set flex grow here to 1, then all this remaining space right here is basically evenly divided by all the remaining elements, because all these elements now have flex grow set to 1. So in this situation right here. All right. But what happens if actually only one of these 5 here would have flex grow set to 1? Well, let's turn this off permanently. And then let's try, for example, here in the first element to set flex grow to 1. So again, first we had flex grow set to 1 on all of the elements, right? So that's why we used here the L selector, which are all of these elements. But now we are setting it only on the very first one. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, now only this element here was allowed to fill up all the remaining space. And so these 4 are still with the size of the content, and then the remaining space was filled up by this element. All right. Let's turn it back off here and back on here so we can see another thing. So setting flex grow to 1 on all of these elements here makes it so that they have the same size. And it wouldn't even have to be 1. What matters is that they are the same number. So if all of them would be 5, then they would still have the same size. Okay, but now if one of them was 2, so let's again try this one here. Well, then this one here would get double of the remaining space than these other ones. So let's see that. And so indeed, this now is a bit bigger than these other ones, right? So this one has 197 pixels, while this one has 108. So having this value here double the flex grow of the other ones doesn't mean that this one here will get double the size. Okay, what it does mean is that it gets double of the available empty space than these other 4 ones. For example, imagine that the empty space was 600 pixels. Then this would get 100, and 100, and 100, and 100, and this one would get 200. And if we set it to something even bigger, then it would get an even bigger portion of the remaining space. Okay? But actually, usually what we do is to simply set flex grow to 1 on all of the flex items, because that's something very usual that we want. So basically having all the elements expanding in order to fill the empty space. And of course, there can still be a gap in between. Let's just use a smaller one so that we still have some space over. All right. And now finally, let's talk about the flex property itself, which remember is a shorthand for these 3. Now the flex property is actually pretty smart. So for example, we can simply set it to 1 like this, and then it will automatically figure out that this means that flex grow should be 1. So we don't need this, and usually we never do it like this. We always write just flex 1, and we then end up with the same result. So as a best practice, we should in fact never use one of these 3 here individually, but always use the flex property. Okay, so this one here is equivalent to using just this, but before, for example, when we had this situation right here, remember, So this, where the content doesn't even fit. But if we really wanted to do this, then we should actually still use the flex property. So the first value is flex grow, which is 0, and then we would set that to 0, because that is the default. Then the second value is flex shrink, which, remember, here we want it set to 0, so we would set that to 0, and then the last one is flex spaces, so this one we want at 200. And so that's it. We can then just turn off these two, and again the result is exactly the same. Okay, so always use the shorthand property and not one of these three here individually. Okay, now this one we don't want. Let's just leave this one here as we finish up this lecture. Now, I know that this is a lot to take in, and I'm sure that it all sounds pretty confusing at this point, especially this flex property. It actually took me quite some time to understand this one myself, and here we are really just scratching the surface. And so I don't really expect you to fully understand what's going on, but it was still important to introduce you to this property at this point so that we can then use it in our big project, and by then it will of course become a lot clearer.